All right. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that your uncle will hate. Today we are going to be talking about media bubbles, censorship, the cancer that is the word terrorist, and the prelude to the next war. I am joined by series regular Elina Xenophontos, and we are going to dive right in. So, first of all, my Instagram account has been blocked to non-followers. Elina has just lost her original account and she had to make a new one. But what's even worse for journalism at large is that there is a multi-platform campaign to deplatform the Cradle media, a journalist-driven news outlet that is free, unowned, and covers geopolitics of West Asia from within. And, real quick, speaking of being a viable media platform, we are on Patreon if you want exclusive content and weekly articles and extra videos. And I hate doing the plug, but I just did the plug and now we're going to move on. So, the Cradle Media has just been kicked off of the Meta platform, and here is their response.
Based in West Asia, and its focus is West Asian geopolitics. We are not going to use foreign monikers to describe and characterize players and actors in this region. That's never going to happen, and that really seems audacious to them. If you're writing in English, you use our language, and we won't do that. We are independent, journalist-driven media. For Meta to suggest that the Cradle or any news organization covering this region, wholly or partially, can report on this conflict without quoting from the actors involved directly in the conflict is ridiculous. You want us to quote Israeli officials and not quote Hezbollah officials or Hamas officials or Ansarullah officials? Who are you to dictate that? Where is free speech? Where is actual journalism being practiced if you cannot present the perspective of both sides? You have to do that, and we do it fully. You may not like our worldview, but I'll tell you, you will find the facts here that you won't find anywhere else. And that's a really important point, a takeaway. If you can't figure out why U.S. policy and European policy has gone so badly in this region over a decade, it's because you operate an information bubble, okay? Your officials operate information bubbles. The Cradle's here to poke holes in information bubbles to present the whole facts from a perspective you haven't heard before. Then you will understand why U.S. policy has gone wrong, why European policy has gone wrong, because it doesn't consider the whole array of perspectives in this region.
Yeah. And so part of their statement, the Cradle has been singled out by Meta because of our foundational mission to cover regional perspectives rarely seen in the media. The attempt to deplatform the Cradle is also part of a much larger campaign to silence accounts that give Palestinians and regional actors a voice and perpetuate the one-dimensional characterization of West Asians in the Western media that has led to mass disinformation and hysteria about this region. And this is a really important topic, and it's one that's kind of near and dear to my heart because people didn't understand why the Afghan war, which I fought in 4 times, went wrong. I mean, I understand it, but most people don't. Most people in the military complex don't understand it. So when they say the Americans and Europeans wonder what went wrong with their Iraqi, Afghan, Syrian, Libyan, Yemeni, Ukraine wars, it's because they operate, again, in an information bubble. So the Cradle media, and to a lesser extent, we do as well, seeks to burst media bubbles and disperse with whitewashed versions of events. You might not like to hear it, but at least you will be informed. So this happened Friday. You actually brought it to my attention, Elina, and it's kind of insane because they don't really say anything crazy or controversial. It's actually very centrist. They don't even talk about leftist subjects like anti-capitalism or anything like that.
No, they provide a platform that's purely fact orientated. They provide a platform where both sides are presented. So you have the Israeli narrative, it's always presented in the Cradle, but at the same time, they just simply provide a platform and they echo the statements made by what the West deems as terrorist organizations. So in this case, it would be any sort of Palestinian resistance movement that isn't sort of affirmed by the West, or Hezbollah, and generally anybody within the axis. So they provide a platform where they give you both sides of the argument, and then they allow for that information to come out in a much more constructive way so that people can form opinions. But that in of itself is a threat, because the entire premise of legacy media, mainstream media, and Western hegemony is to promote a single narrative and to suppress narratives that counter their argument. And the Cradle does that because, much like you said, they're not advocating themselves as a left-wing platform. They're just simply a media news outlet that provides the facts. That is it.
From the region, from people who grew up in the region. Yeah. So,
and understand the internal dynamics and culture and
yeah. Also, I was talking to my friend Josephine about this. She's a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. She used to work for the Defense Intelligence Agency and the ODNI and the NSA. And we were talking about not just this media bias, but also within the Western intelligence communities. Because intelligence isn't this pristine thing. What intelligence is, it's a data set of curated information that's processed, synthesized into a product that is quickly digestible by decision makers. So we were talking about the intelligence collection cycle, where she was the analyst, I was a human collector. So I was collecting human intelligence stuff on the ground. If that's like either atmospheric information about like who the players are in a certain town, valley, whatever, or by doing tactical questioning of high value targets or high value individuals. And I would write up a SSC report and send that in to the S2, the intelligence section, and it would get sucked up into the intelligence synchronization process that also has like signal intelligence. And it was a job for an analyst to sort all of this information to come up with a analysis and an advisory opinion for decision makers, and also to prove legally that we could, for instance, drone strike some random guy. So there's multiple levels of bias going on within the intelligence cycle. It's me collecting it on the ground, the analyst sorting it, the commander approving it, and the judge or the lawyer and JAG approving the kinetic strike. So if your entire institution and everybody in it has these problematic views about about like Muslims or people from a certain type part of the world, you have like 4 degrees of that reinforcing itself. And even like the intelligence community is completely compromised by this systemic issue. It's not just the media. It's like literally every aspect of how we make decisions and how we're informed about what's happening in West Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa.
Yeah, because it boils down to how the legal system defines the kind of behaviors that are deemed problematic or a threat, which for the most part, from a legal perspective, they tend to be very ambiguous and broad, which then sort of trickles down into the process by which analytics take place, because the way in which you then are sort of structured to gather the information, what you're looking for, which is tailored to a particular framework that's been established from the legal structure, and that's in itself established by the state that is heavily compromised. At that point, you are now functioning within the parameters that's been defined, and it creates a problem because what you're looking for is individuals that fit a certain criteria of terrorism that, and again, or for example, dangerous individuals that are purely subjective. I mean, it's a purely subjective approach, if you understand what I mean, legally speaking, because then we can get into a conversation as to, again, it sort of falls back into this notion of what is deemed as terrorist, who is a terrorist, who is a threat, what kind of actions are deemed problematic. And then obviously, when you're coming at it from a Western angle, it's going to be very different to how it's perceived within, for example, in this case, Western Asia, and how they perceive the role of the West and how that acts and how the individuals act within that region. So again, conflating terrorism with resistance and all that. So it becomes very nuanced.
Right. And I don't think these massive apparatuses in the intelligence, the media community have space for that. It's not just problematic legal frameworks that authorize heedless kinetic strikes or drone strikes of people that probably, I know for a fact, in some cases, were not even associated with the Islamic State or the Taliban or the Haqqani or Al Qaeda. just because the framework was so compromised. But it's also that this way of thinking and about where these campaigns and these wars went wrong and why nobody recognized that they were going so poorly is because it's not only this problematic idea of terrorism, it's also this problematic idea of American exceptionalism and strength. And it's completely feasible. I've seen it happen. People thinking, oh, we're totally winning this war when we totally were not. It was basically a holding action. And when Afghanistan's imperialist cycle was complete, we pulled out in the most irresponsible way possible. That had to do with elections, it had to do with Biden's political aspirations and a bunch of other things. But yeah, it's this self-reinforcing kind of feedback loop that exists in an echo chamber. And that in itself is what the powers that be, and this is not conspiratorial, this is easily demonstrable. That's what the powers that be want. So you will accept these wars and you will just have the thought terminating cliche, oh, they're terrorists. Oh, they're anti-American. Oh, they hate us for our freedom, and just be done with it. And, go to Starbucks and, live, laugh, love, and buy shit on Amazon. So that's why they want to deplatform the cradle, obviously.
Of course, because essentially, listen, the one of the ways in which to sustain control is the control of information, how that information is presented. And we've spoken before, but obviously it wasn't on Colonial Outcasts, it was on Mint Press, sorry. We spoke about, manufacturing consent. The way in which you manufacture consent is by providing these sort of narratives through legitimate formats, whether it's in the form of think tanks that we've established are themselves compromised because they receive large amounts of lucrative financial support from the very same corporations, Silicon Valley and Wall Street, that run the state, who are also the ones to gain the most out of these particular wars. For instance, you spoke specifically about Afghanistan, and we know about the level of money that was laundered through Afghanistan and the amount of money that was made through the military industrial complex. So when you have a system that is very complex in its web of spreading misinformation. So we have think tanks which are compromised that receive their funding from these organizations, but then you also have, we spoke about the Silicon Valley, for example, and their control through Google, for instance. Google just in July of 2024 controls 91% of the search engines in the world. So as in Google is used 91% of the time. And we know for a fact that Google itself filters the information that you will receive. And so they're the ones that present, if you type in anything, if you type in what's happening in Palestine, what's happening, I don't know, in Ukraine, the information will be decided by an organization, a multinational corporation that one benefits drastically from the wars and from the current state, the economic crisis of the world. And they will then dictate the information that you are digesting. And this is a form of imperialism in itself, because it's one of the means by which to sustain imperialism. And the Cradle is one of the many independent media outlets, smaller in size, but there are sort of countering that information war. And we can discuss this later, but there was also a really fantastic report that I think it was from USAID. It was leaked, actually. Not leaked. It was not leaked. That was inaccurate. It was actually revealed as a result of the Freedom of Information Act. And it was a 97-page report discussing specifically, for example, how USAID, through its other mediums and platforms, tries to sort of counter misinformation, disinformation, but also malinformation. I really want to talk about malinformation. But you see, they have all these mediums by which to control information. And the Cradle is one such example where, because it counters the Western imperialist narrative, they are trying to shut it down. But the Cradle is only one such example. In just this week alone, we've seen multiple other examples like this take place.
Yeah, it almost seems like something's brewing. Also, you touched on these companies that subsidize or give money to these think tanks to manufacture consent for more wars, saying like, hey, we need to intervene in this country, we need to intervene in that country. Well, last week, wait, was this last week? No, this was earlier this week. We saw the most egregious example of corporate warmongering, I think, that I've seen in a long time. So you know what Palantir is? They're a defense contractor. I think J.R. J.R.R. Tolkien would be very upset that one of his magical artifacts was being used as a name for like a spyware tech and AI defense contractor company, but that's beside the point. So, yeah, Alex Karp, the U.S. will very likely fight a three-front war against Russia, China, and Iran, Palantir's Alex Karp says. So the U.S. military has long prioritized the ability to fight war simultaneously, but Alex Karp, CEO of the data mining software company Palantir, which is known for its work on defense and intelligence, warned us the U.S. may have to wage war in 3 different theaters in the future. And then he talks about how, in fact, given that we have parity technologically with China and Russia, but we don't have parity morally, they have a huge advantage, saying that because China and Russia and Iran are so immoral that they have an advantage against us. This is an absurd argument. It's completely imperialist in nature. And he's basically, if you read this article that's on Yahoo Finance, I think it's Broken Fortune magazine, you can just basically see the fingerprints of his colonial and interventionist designs all over this. And this broke today. So the gears and the players and movers and shakers of things are totally gearing up for war. That's what it looks like. We're starting to see these interviews happen. Also Eric Prince is back in the news, the mercenary captain of the UAE, former founder of Blackwater. And yeah, the drums are beating. So I guess this would be a good time to kind of define imperialism and how it functions, because we take for granted that some people might be kind of new to this, because a lot of people have only become politically active since October and in the past few months. So every once in a while, we like to redefine what imperialism is. And that's what I'm going to do for the next 2.5 minutes. So just so you can recognize what is happening in this whole massive military, industrial, media, academic apparatus that is manufacturing consent for war, wants more wars. And this is nothing new. I kind of studied this stuff in college, focusing on India and the British Raj. And I thought it only really existed to this egregious degree in history books, but nope, I was naive at the time. So imperialism then is this huge global phenomenon, and it's insanely expansive and complicated topic that resists simple explanations. However, this is the boilerplate definition that I generally use as an intro for the layman and people who want to learn more about this subject. And this is important to understand because you cannot understand modern global politics without a basic grasp of imperialism, and specifically Western imperialism. Some people would argue that imperialism only applies to Western nations. I disagree, but we're going to move on. So imperialism, there are many dictionary definitions, but for our purposes here, we are going to call imperialism an extension of one country by its authority over another territory outside of its borders. So you will have an imperial power like England extending its control over another territory, which we will call a colony. History varies, experience varies. Comparing British colonial rule of India, for example, and the current manifestation of the American empire is clunky, obviously, but all empires have a set of characteristics. For the most part, their abilities and mechanisms of control over their colonies basically center around three characteristics of colonialism, of an empire extending control over a territory outside of itself. First, and we see this all the time in MENA countries, the Middle East and North Africa, is political control, most frequently exercised by outright conquest and military occupation. But military control also involves local allies and collaborators, and an attempt to cultivate local elites using a combination of coercion and reward. So, like the CIA definitely had a vested interest in installing the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, and now they're kind of beholden to us for a lot of other complicated factors. But all of this is how empire exerts political and administrative control over a colony. So first one's military. Second instrument is economic. The imperial systems, the economy of the colony serves the interests of the imperial power. So the wealth of the colony, its resources, its labor is extracted and brought to the imperial power and not used for the benefit of the colony or the people who live in the colony. In addition, the colonies were never really free to trade with anyone they wished. In fact, they would only trade with the imperial power or sometimes with other colonies of that power. So we're talking about a very extensive level of economic control over the colony. Third instrument of control is social. Social control includes things like language, education, the arts, and in most cases, the imperial power intended to suppress or destroy the local culture and customs of the people. All universities and libraries and museums are destroyed in Gaza. For instance, there is an actual effort, and this has been going on for decades, to erase Palestinian identity. So saying that Palestinians aren't actually a people, they were never a people, etc. Also, there was an imposition of ideas from the imperial power to the colony, ideas like racism, religion, capitalism. All of these were integrated into the structure of the imperial control of the colony. So, all of this has a profound impact, and we call this like the post-colonial legacy, i.e., for countries emerging into independence after having been colonies for so long, they immediately face a whole set of challenges. Political challenge about self-governance over an intentionally divided socio-cultural landscape, the colonizer play of divide and rule, the economic challenges like how to develop their economies when their economic interests were tied for so long and serving an imperial power. How do we devise and set up an economic framework that will serve our interests? This is like the great challenge of Africa and African countries. So, from a social perspective, the post colonial legacy has left behind an enormous amount of issues related to language, the role of culture, and religion in these societies. So, today, imperialism continues to cast a very long shadow. So, that was imperialism in a nutshell. It starts with these problematic ideas. It requires that you orientalize people. Professor Edward Said talked about this in his groundbreaking watershed book, Orientalism, how orientalizing someone is necessary for colonization in some ways. That's very reductive, but you can't suppress a people and try to erase them unless you think they're savages and they need to be civilized. So we see this all the time. We're seeing this in the media landscape, this direct manifestation of all these imperial structures and ideologies. And holy shit, nothing has changed. And that's why the Cradle, outlets like the Cradle, who put a human face and perspectives and a different sides of opinion, need to go, because they're messing with the imperialist agenda, which is inherently capitalist.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two things I was going to say. So the thing with the Cradle as well is that it's not even relatively new, right? So I just wanted to bring it to the attention. Obviously, there's a lot of other cases we can get into, but when it comes to the banning of media outlets, we've already seen that as well. Israel banned Al Jazeera from being able to report. That went completely pretty much uncondemned. This just hasn't been condemned by Western mainstream media at all. And then we saw the entirety of the Western world banning Russian media outlets, which I think was absolutely redundant, because in any state of democracy, yeah, sure, RT is funded by the Russian state. No one's denying that. But the whole idea of having freedom of press is to allow for counter opinions to be able to make their case. It's sort of like going into a courtroom. I've always said this. When you're going to go into a criminal case, you have the defense and you have the prosecution. Each side has a right to represent their facts and their case, and then it is up to the jury and the judge, based on that information, to be able to counter both information and come to the ultimate truth. This is also the very basis of dialectics. So when you start banning things like Russia Today for the purpose of them being able to monopolize the narrative, you've already set a precedent. So banning Russia Today was sort of not Russia Today. It was Russia Today. Russia Today RT. I think that's what it's abbreviated for. Yeah, RT, and then banning everything that was Russian orientated. And then now we've also seen a lot with regards to what happened to the COVID media outlets that were sort of countering that narrative, but they were using fact-based arguments that then they were also shut down. So the cradle is really part and parcel of a practice that has now been normalized, specifically in the last 4 years. We have seen a huge amping up of this sort of media censorship. So I just wanted to say that. And then what I also wanted to bring in, so when we're discussing this within the frame of imperialism, I always try to tell people one very basic thing, is that imperialism, much like globalization, which is just another sort of term for imperialism in itself, is at the root of it an economic theory. It's an economic structure, because it's the very premise of imperialism is for the purpose of exploitation, right? It is for the purpose of preserving the finance and the wealth of the ruling class at all times. So when you have a system which is an economic system that requires exploitation, it means it's premised on an idea to preserve consistent inequality. And then you have to sort of start breaking down, how does that happen? And for example, from the perspective, the way capitalism has evolved over the years, we know that through industrialization, eventually the rules of competition collapse, which then lead to the financialization to come through the banking sector that then exports that to the underdeveloped world, as they would call it. So then to exploit that when their local markets can no longer support the competitive structures that will allow them to maximize profits consistently. So at the core of it, imperialism is capitalism at its peak, and it's how it attempts to sustain its wealth. And then to legitimize that economic structure, they have to have a political structure. So we have political imperialism, which is through the form of these, the United Nations, I could definitely find as a form of political imperialism, because it is structured based on and funded by Western sort of notions of liberal democracy, and then they use their institutions as mediums by which to impose sort of like Western values, and even because that's the thing, when people say the United Nations, people forget the World Bank is part of the United Nations, the IMF is part of the United Nations. These are part of the United Nations institutions. So you have these sort of centralized legal structures and political structures that then assert themselves to preserve imperialism. And then you have what I call the third stage, which is cultural imperialism. And that also serves. So when you have cultural imperialism, what that does is that it, by even westernizing, cultures internationally and imposing a one single way of life, it also helps to regulate and form market demands even, and controlling how the market works. Supply and demand works based on influencing culture as well. So it all comes together then to sustain this system that serves multinationals and those that are gaining the most out of this imperialist structure. And to go back to obviously how this comes into into this particular conversation, is that, for example, beyond the cradle, something else has happened, and I came out yesterday, was, I don't know for those of you that know, but I personally find it to be an exquisite independent journalist, and I know we've discussed it in person, Richard Medhurst as well, who is a British Syrian investigative journalist. He himself, on his way back to, I think he was on his way back to London, he was arrested at Heathrow Airport, and he was basically arrested under the Terrorist Act Section 12. He was basically put through 24 hours worth of humiliation, where he was stuck in solitary. They put him in solitary for a day. They weren't allowing him to have access to his family or even to lawyers. Nobody even knew for 24 hours where he was. He actually put a video up on the internet, 10 minutes long, explaining exactly the ordeal he went through. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because to charge a journalist under the Terrorism Act, Section 12, specifically discussing in this instance, Section 12 is addressing the fact that he's allegedly giving a platform to terrorist organizations or legitimizing them, aka because obviously he's speaking on behalf of the Palestinians and addressing the Palestinian resistance, which under international law, Palestinians, we now know, even with the ICJ ruling of the 19th of July, do have a right to armed resistance because they're an occupied people. This is enshrined in law because of Richard's position in airing out, much like the Cradle, the position of the Palestinian resistance movements, etc. He has now been deemed as promoting terrorist organizations, which now limits his ability to be able to report on the matter. And so it's in the space of 1 week, we have seen one journalist essentially being arrested and treated like a criminal, essentially, for doing his job. We've seen the Cradle being banned throughout Meta. And all this comes together because, and this is how it falls into the imperialist argument, and I'll wrap it up because I've been talking for a while. But it's part of the agenda right now that I'm seeing, and which you also touched on. The West, or rather, and I don't like to say West, the capitalists in the West are looking now at a three-front war. So just as they've been escalating with Ukraine, what they're trying to do right now in Western Asia is to use the momentum of the genocide and everything that's happening to expand a war that will target Syria, it will target Lebanon, and it will target Yemen and Iran. And why? Because these countries, as it currently stands, are standing against the imperialist agenda, which is to dominate the entire region. Iran does stand against that. Whatever our opinion is of what's happening in Iran is irrelevant. The idea is that it is anti-imperialist from the argument that it doesn't allow, at this point, for its resources to be exploited, for its maritime trade routes to be exploited, for Western Asia to be exploited. So what we're seeing is the play out of an entire war that's about to break out in Western Asia for the imperialist objectives of the region. And they're now silencing voices like Medhurst, like the Cradle, who are anti-war, who are trying to bring voices, who are trying to inform the public as to how dangerous the situation is, so as to allow for one single narrative that will almost basically create this manufactured consent among the Western audience.
Yeah, and getting involved in the region again, getting involved in all these wars that don't need to happen. It's giving 2003 Iraq war vibes. And let's just replay an infamous interview, or famous interview by Democracy Now! Of former U.S. General Wesley Clark about his experience in the buildup to the Iraq War and what these hardened, like, interventionist neoconservatives like Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld were saying and trying to do at the time. It is kind of virtually, in the performative effect, indistinguishable from what's happening now. And this was a Republican presidency. All of this is happening currently under a Democratic presidency. So let's get into it.
9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail."
Yep, that's clearly how the U.S. deals with everything. Now we've transitioned from direct military intervention to proxies, but yeah, performative effect still the same. More money, more weapons, more bombs.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office, today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me."
Okay, so this whole idea within the U.S. foreign policy apparatus about bombing Iran goes back so long that it was a little jingle based off the Beach Boys song Barbaran. It goes bomb 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 Iran, bomb 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 Iran. Yeah, so this is not nothing new. There has always been this movement within the U.S. government apparatus to engage in a conflict with Iran. And it's important to realize at this time in 2001, 2003, the axis of resistance didn't exist in the way it exists now. And that's because of U.S. interventionism we create all of our own problems. So let's we're going to play this out for one more minute where he talks about Iran.
And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, "You remember that?" He said, "Sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you."
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So go through the countries again.
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran. So when you look at Iran, you say, is it a replay? It's not exactly a replay, but here's the truth, that Iran from the beginning has seen that the presence of the United States in Iraq was a threat. A blessing, because we took out Saddam Hussein and the Baathists. They couldn't handle them. We took care of it for them. But also a threat because they knew that they were next on the hit list. And so...
And yes, there is a hit list. That's how U.S. foreign policy is done, through hit lists.
Of course they got engaged. They lost 1 million people during the war with Iraq. And they've got a long and unprotectable, unsecurable border. So it was in their vital interest to be deeply involved inside Iraq. They tolerated our attacks on the Baathists. They were happy we captured Saddam Hussein, but they're building up their own network of influence, and to cement it, they occasionally give some military assistance and training and advice, either directly or indirectly, to both the insurgents and to the militias. And
really appreciate how he doesn't use the word terrorist.
And in that sense, it's not exactly parallel, because there has been, I believe, continuous Iranian engagement. Some of it legitimate, some of it illegitimate. I mean, you can hardly fault Iran because they're offering to do eye operations for Iraqis who need medical attention. That's not an offense that you can go to war over, perhaps, but it is an effort to gain influence.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that people have been looking for a reason for so long. And now that this escalation is happening in the Middle East, as you said, from momentum based off this genocide and the Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis, response in the Gulf of Aden, in the Red Sea, and what's happening in Syria and Iraq with the militias. I think the drums again are beating, and it all goes back to this censorship and deplatforming, and because we can't have dissenting opinions, and what they fear is a repeat of Gaza for the next war, where you'd have U.S. forces intervening, and you're going to be seeing it all over social media, dead kids from U.S. bombs.
So I had several things to say.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I just wanted to clarify a point that he had actually made with Saddam Hussein, which I always think gets missed, is that Saddam Hussein was in many ways a beast created in a way by the US as well, because they did actually fund and support him during the Gulf War as well. And he had committed very atrocious crimes against the Iranians. So I also do find it interesting, it's just something that's a point that needs to be remembered. He was a useful tyrant until he was no longer useful, which is also, the way in which the imperialists usually tend to function as well, by creating these comprador sort of nations. Now, when it comes to Iran, it's also, just to contextualize it a little bit as well, Iran itself has been a victim of Western imperialism, which is why they have such starch anti-imperialist sentiment that is very prevalent among the Iranian people. I mean, at the end of the day, when they were run by the Shah, who was rather brutal in many ways, and was imposing liberalism, but also basically was selling off the country and its wealth to Anglo-American oil companies. And even when there was the 1951 revolution, it was essentially like a movement that put in place a sort of leftist party that was actually progressive, not even Islamic or anything like that. That was easily put down 2 years later with a coup. I think the coup happened in 1953. If I'm getting the dates wrong, I do apologize. That was pretty much established by the West and put the Shah into power again. And as a result of all his brutal sort of liberal policies that affected the working class, then that's where we saw the sort of Islamic Revolution of 1979. But up until that point, it's important to understand that Iran was one of the two pillars in the Middle East for the US, meaning that if you had control over Iran and Saudi Arabia, you basically controlled the oil wealth, you controlled trade routes. So in terms for an imperialist perspective, this is paramount, because you're able to essentially control the global economy if you can control Iran and if you can control Saudi Arabia. Now imagine what happened since 1979, where you have now a new revolution that's taking place that's completely anti-American. They can't control it. So they have been working up this project. Like you said, it's been long in the making now to sort of provoke and start a war with Iran. And even the RAND Corporation, I always go back to this piece because I think it's so they've also published a piece, I think it was in 2009, and it's about 100 and I think over 100 pages of how to go about starting a war with Iran without being the ones that look bad, which I always find absolutely hilarious. And they even actually discuss bringing in a deal and offering Iran a deal that they can't sort of reject, so as to then find a way to pull out of the deal, blaming it on them and then justifying an attack. So they've used multiple means by which to do that. So what we're seeing now play out in the region is really an opportunity here to do something that's been long in the works. But this is the thing, Iran and the the region of Western Asia is no longer in the position that it was 10 years ago. And I mean, it's the same thing that kind of happened with Ukraine and Russia, where they have been preparing themselves for something that they knew was coming. So General Soleimani, oh God, I'm terrible with names.
General Soleimani,
he was killed. Yeah, he was pretty much sort of like the brain behind the establishment of the axis of resistance in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, etc. And so yeah.
For context, General Soleimani was the commander of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, kind of like their special forces wing. So cultivating resistance fronts and establishing intelligence relationships and stuff like that. Yeah.
And he was killed he was obviously assassinated as well in 2019 under Trump. But this is the thing, he had established a very complex network of resistance in the region for this very purpose of providing not just some sort of prophylactic measures for Iran, but also to aid the region to countering these more imperialist incursions within the region. And so now what we're seeing is a very well-structured resistance movement, an axis within the region that has been very well prepared and trained. And I just want to finish on one small little point. At this point, and this is what I think we've discussed in person as well with you, it's become apparent that the West has no choice. As in, if you're a Western finance capitalist and you're an imperialist, you have no choice but to actually go to war, a three-front war. Because what is essentially happening, I was reading the other day, I was going through the stats for like BRICS as well and G7. The G7 is now basically has around 28 to 30% of produces 20 to 30% of the world's GDP, as opposed to BRICS nations, which are at 35. And then when you add the new nations that have now been added into BRICS, that takes it up to 48. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing a huge growth basically taking place that is favoring BRICS nations. And as the West diminishes in power in terms of its economic capabilities, it will no longer have the economic abilities to assert itself internationally. And even now, with the sort of the debt bubble that's occurring in the United States, there is no way, it's not a recession anymore. What we're talking about is a consistent shrinking economy. And this is the result of finance capitalism. And what's happening is that as it shrinks, the dollar will lose its power, which is already losing. And they're also making their situation worse, as we've discussed before with the sanctions. So we're seeing the US and Western position in general, particularly the ruling class, is becoming significantly weak. And as we see the global South rising and industrializing and become more powerful, their ability to exploit many nations economically therefore counters a very construct of imperialism that requires them to be economically weak. And so if the West was now to just say, right, we're not going to continue the war with Ukraine, we'll concede in Western Asia, that's it for them. It basically means that BRICS will rise, and the global shift in economics will basically thwart and basically bring an end to imperialism. So the kind of economic imperialism that we've experienced up to this point. So war, destruction, chaos is pretty much at this point the last thing that they could do. That is my analysis on this.
Yeah, I would give a slight alteration from my perspective. If this was like a new policy, I would say, yeah, it's the last thing they would do. But they've been doing it for so long. You know, we brought up the Iranian Revolution in like 1979. Well, the government was born out of us deposing the democratically elected leader of Iran, replacing him with the Shah, who was a monarch that had a brutal repression campaign and was a complete Western asset. And then he was overthrown by a popular revolution. And this is just what we do. Overthrow governments, create chaos. But you think it's different this time?
Yeah, just because of the economic situation of the West. That's what makes a difference. Because back in the 70s, I mean, you still had, the US was still far more economically powerful. It was still sort of relatively industrialized. And the Reagan policies of neoliberal finance sort of just started kicking in. But what we're seeing now is 30 years of neoliberal economic policies that have completely destroyed America's industrial capacity. It's weakened its economic structure. It's been constantly shrinking. So now, it's almost it's before it was about sustaining their control. Now it's more about, right, we have reached that point of no return. It's at the end, and they're desperately trying to prevent at this point what is the inevitable. But at the end of the day, it was always inevitable, but now it's just manifesting. These are kind of like the rules of economics, but unfortunately, the Western elite, the ruling class, they function on short-term gains, and so this is what happens. We won't get into that now. That's a whole other episode by itself. But that's why I think it's different now.
Well, our political and military and intelligence apparatus is kind of like modeled over like quarterly returns, like short-term results right now, instant gratification. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to maximize this stuff. And I can see corollaries and ties to that with the drone strike campaign. No thought was put into that, but they just needed to produce a body count so they could go back and tell people, hey, look at the progress we're making. And it wasn't really progress at all. So it's election season. Everybody's going for having opinions and stuff. Will a Kamala Harris presidency or a Trump presidency affect this decline at all?
I'm sorry, I just want to make a point. Do you mean Kamala the communist? Because apparently that's what she's being called. Yeah, Kamala the communist. She's going to save the day. No, I honestly don't think it's going to make a difference, because again, it's the sort of the current state of the economic realities of the Western structures, and it sort of boils down into, again, what I've mentioned before, the difference between a financialized system and what that does to an economy. And they don't have the capabilities anymore to combat, to get themselves out of the day. First of all, it's impossible. And as that happens, as the economic chaos will unravel, which is at this point, it's irreversible, they will need to take action. It's either take action or accept that it's going to happen and save what you can. But the way I see it with Trump, Kamala, Democrats, is sort of bipartisan, corporate controlled, Silicon Valley sweethearts, both of them, and Wall Street sweethearts. They're not going to change policy. Everything is just more, it's like a Hollywood-esque show. He calls her a communist. She tells people to keep quiet. She's talking, and everybody, it's like a Hollywood show, honestly. It's like a, what, you guys have SNL or something? It's kind of funny at the same time.
Yeah,
I kind of find it amusing.
Yeah, I would agree. It really doesn't matter at this point if it's Trump or Harris. They're really not that different. And I think when capitalism, this has been happening when finance capitalism started really eating itself and the floodgates opened and this started to really deteriorate quickly. I think that was the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the FEC. which was the landmark decision of the Supreme Court of the U.S. regarding campaign finance laws and free speech under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The court held that in a 5-4 decision, because there's 9 Supreme Court justices, that the freedom of speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting independent expenditures for political campaigns by corporations, nonprofits, labor unions, and other associations, ruling that corporations essentially are people. It was insane. So
I mean,
because corporations are people, they have the right to free speech, and free speech is campaign finance. Giving
which
people
is just
money
legalized
is
bribery.
the freedom of speech. Yeah.
It's just legalized bribery, essentially. It's legalized bribery. I mean, like we said, this is how you manufacture control, consent. And actually, I think I wanted to actually bring up the fact as well, because now we're looking at how there's a huge crackdown on dissenting voices. We mentioned Richard Medhurst. There's been other cases like Craig Murray, who's sort of like a diplomat in the UK, MP politician, and all that. But it's also important to know what happened with the Julian Assange case, because we had an episode on that, and I think it sort of ties in nicely with this particular episode. So Julian Assange, in the end, was allowed to go free, but it wasn't without a cost. So although he was allowed to go free, he had to plead guilty, and he had to plead guilty to conspiring against the state under the Espionage Act. But it was considered that as he had essentially served, I don't know, something like more than that, 50 years at this point, because of his solitary confinement in Belmarsh prison, but also he was kept in the Ecuadorian embassy for many years as well. This was considered to be sort of a case closed. But what this actually did, although he was able to go free, is that he was able to go free. It criminalized journalism, and it set a very dangerous precedent that we're also now seeing manifesting against all these particular individuals and personas who are speaking against the state, or speaking not against the state, against sort of the elite structures and the imperial agenda within the generally that's happening around the world. Because
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out how absurd the Julian Assange case was. He was charged under the Espionage Act from the First World War, which is a U.S. law, and he was an Australian citizen. So, what? It just shows you how mutable and how kind of fungible laws are, and the rule of law is when you mess with the money and the power.
And all he did was just reveal information from a whistleblower, which in this case was Chelsea Manning. He just revealed information as a journalist is supposed to do. If information is given to you, you actually have a legal obligation to publish that information. And that's exactly what he did. And so by criminalizing that activity and by basically now setting the precedent that any sort of journalist that publishes information that threatens the sort of the imperialist and capitalist apparatus, this is what we're going to be doing now. We're going to essentially be we're going to be sentencing them under the Espionage Act. And now we're seeing people like Richard Medhurst, who's been accused under the Terrorism Act and treated like a criminal, as was Craig Murray. He was basically investigated under Section 7 of the Terrorism Act, which, by the way, because you want to talk about bipartisan politics in the US, let's bring that to the UK. The Terrorism Act was actually established by the Labour Party under Tony Blair, who was also the one that advocated for war. So, going back to, they're supposed to be left. Obviously not. They're just they're agents of the state. They by giving themselves the image that they belong to the left, it just sort of creates a system by which establishes a system of illusion and choice that people have, but in actuality they serve the same capitalist elites. And by the way, I also wanted to bring up, because something I think is also important, is what the USAID report defines as, because I mentioned it earlier on, and I just want to bring people's attention to this. So in this report, which was sort of exposed as a result, as I said, of the Freedom of Information Act, the USAID basically wrote a 97-page report discussing means by which to control information to serve supposedly Western values and democracy, etc. And in that report, they defined misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Now, misinformation is inaccurate information that's given without intent to deceive. Disinformation is inaccurate information given with the intent to deceive. But then there's malinformation. This is where they focus the most, and why I'm bringing this up now, because it's very relevant. Malinformation is information that is accurate. If information is presented, particularly by journalists and people like the Cradle, etc., which is accurate, but it doesn't serve the agenda, and it can become, quote, harmful. So, for example, and this example is actually given. The ethnic cleanse, Israel is committing an ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. Well, that's technically correct, but it's harmful information because it harms the mainstream narrative. So they were cracking down, they were finding ways by which to crack down as well and censor not just misinformation or disinformation, but what they called malinformation, which is actually accurate information. So this becomes a major threat, because what they're saying now, it's so broad at this point that even accurate information is deemed as fake news, because even though the information is correct, it counters a narrative. And this is basically, and this is USAID, and they have so much control over these fact-checking organizations like Bellingcat, and they also work closely with your favorite, the Atlantic Council, which is also bought to, your favorite. I'm going to buy your t-shirt. I told you, I'm going to send you a t-shirt. It's going to be Atlantic. I love the Atlantic Council, and I want you to wear it as well.
Yeah. Just so you know, the Atlantic Council is a think tank that's heavily influential in Washington. It's also an intelligence cutout for like 3-letter agencies in the United States. And I hate them. So that's what she's referring to. But malinformation. So we do malinformation on Colonial Outcasts. We do a lot of malinformation around here. So yeah, just wrapping up. That's actually a great thing to pull all of this full circle. We spent a lot of time talking about imperialism. This is the main focus of the show, really, and imperialism is maintained by an uninformed public about how it affects them, about the price paid by not only themselves but people in the global South, and we're kind of watching its collapse. It's going to take a long time. There's a lot of inertia behind Western hegemony. So as we're going to a multipolar world order, we're still going to be a dominant force. And as the powers that be begin to lose their grip and control and their dominance, they will become, this happens every time, more violent. So when they say World War III could happen, I don't think it's going to happen now. I don't think it's going to happen over this, but this is not a far stretch that this could be a multi-front war involving great powers. You just had the CEO of Palantir, who obviously lobbies heavily in Washington, saying that that's what they're looking for. And by the way, buy my AI, buy my software for your defense platforms. Yeah, you're just seeing a system in collapse. Now, even the veneer of free speech is going down the toilet, and it will continue to go down the toilet whether or not Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is elected. And yeah, it's 2024. Our tagline around here is kind of like, if you love 2024, you're going to absolutely love 2025, because it's going to get worse before it gets worse. So free speech will continue to be penalized. Independent reporting will be deplatformed, and the drums for war are beating. Final thoughts?
Oh, I completely agree with everything you said. I think the only thing I would say is slightly different, maybe I'm being more pessimistic, is that my opinion is that we kind of already are in a World War III situation, not overtly, but sort of covertly through, right, all the proxies, but also the economic warfare that's breaking out now. I mean, between the US, China, Russia, etc. So we're seeing a lot of activity, because at the end of the day, war isn't just military in nature. It's also economic warfare, which can be even more dramatic, and that's already been taking place, and it can be absolutely catastrophic, as we've discussed before. The implication of sanctions, for example, which can starve off and have starved off hundreds of thousands of people, which is an act of war. I mean, you might as well just nuke them, so to speak, because it has the same sort of level of impact in the end. The only thing I would say is, like, in a way, we kind of are in a kind of World War III situation that's only going to escalate. But it's just different to how possibly we would have envisioned it. But I think all the characteristics in a way are there. But other than that, I mean, I just completely agree with everything that you stated, everything.
Yeah. Well,
Positive.
guys,
What a positive note to leave that on.
yeah. I'm about I gotta end this because I have a flight out to the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, which is a freaking liberal fascist shit show where they're chanting USA, USA. Oh my god. So I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna cover the protest action there. The cops have been chill. My friends on the ground have been telling me they don't want the optics of beating the crap out of protesters, anti-genocide protesters, while Kamala Harris is speaking. She's speaking tomorrow, so maybe we're gonna force the issue. Who knows? I'm not plugged into the organization or planning because I'm a security hazard because, obviously I'm very prominent. So I have no idea what's going to go on, but I will be covering it and I will be live streaming it. So hope to see y'all there. This has been our media bubble episode. Hope y'all enjoyed it. And Elina, thanks as always for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, y'all, we're going to post this immediately and we'll see you after the DNC. Cheers, y'all.